I'm Kevin Dunn. I'm a professor of international relations and Africana studies here at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, which is a small college in the Finger Lakes of New York.
Great, and thanks for joining us to talk today about the Congo and Liberia, if we have time, and your book, Politics of Origin in Africa. And I'd like you to explain to us how you came to this book, and it's about 11 years old now, and what you've seen since you've written.
Yeah, thanks. Well, John, it's great to be here, and thanks for inviting me. This work is a collaborative work with a friend of mine, Morten Boas, who's a Norwegian scholar, and we've been researching and working in Africa, various parts of Africa, since the 20th century, since we were both graduate students. And we'll eventually, sometimes come together and have conversations. And I was doing work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, especially in the East, around issues of political identity and land and questions of belonging, which are wrapped into this concept of autochthony. And I met up with Morten at I forget where we were. It might have been San Francisco or an academic conference, and we're checking in. And he was having the exact same conversations in his work in West Africa, looking in Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire. And so we were looking at the same phenomena in different parts of the continent. And I was also looking in Kenya as well. So we decided we had to get together and start working through our ideas about what we were seeing, but also building this book on those four cases of Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, Congo, and Kenya, which are the four cases that we know the best because those issues around autochthony, around political identity and land, have become violent, right? So that was we were trying to tease that out. Why in these four cases, and why in Africa, which before colonialism, political identity was very porous. You could move from what we refer to now as ethnic groups with some degree of ease. You could marry in. There was more inclusive than exclusionary practices, and a different relationship to land. That with colonialism and then in the post-colonialism has changed dramatically. So that's kind of trying to figure out why that happened in certain places and not in others.
And it is a focus primarily on identity and land, correct?
Right. So I mean, the question of autochthony, it comes from the Greek, and it can be understood either as sons of the soil or emanating from the soil. It's the claim, it gets used as a claim that this is our land, though that's often problematic because, it's more seen as we were here first, right? We were here first before you. Therefore, because we got here first before you, then we have certain political rights. We can own land. We can vote in elections. We can run for elections. And you, the stranger, the immigrant, you're a latecomer. So you don't get to own lands, run for elections, or vote, right? Those kind of core aspects of political identity. What rights, what privileges come from your political identity? The argument around autochthony is that's going to be defined by whether you're autochthonous, whether you deserve to be here or you got here first versus a latecomer. And this is not anything that is specific to Africa, right? I mean, the kind of, you can probably already hear the rhetoric, the language there in terms of anti-immigration. We were here first. You're a latecomer. You don't get the same privileges and rights. We see that in the Americas, in the United States. We see it across Europe. So one of the things that was happening with Morten and I is that we were seeing this in Africa, but we are also living this by seeing I live in the United States, he lives in Norway. We can see this trend occurring across Europe, the America, across the globe, right? So we're trying to tease out those issues about how political identity is being framed with specific reference to land that we got here before you did.
Yeah, and I appreciate it in the book how it's laid out in kind of these three different categories, which is, patriarchal kind of relationship to land, concepts of space, and this natural privatization of land.
Right.
That seemed to me to be, that's part of the colonial project, which kind of contradicts this whole notion, because if the colonial project is coming into land and saying, this is now ours, even though you were here first. So
right.
how does colonialism jive that, square that circle, while at the same time creating this situation?
Yeah, and that understanding of one's relationship to the land, the patriarchal, right? This can go from father to son, right? It's very specific, passing down, dividing up land in a kind of a territorial space and then to be privately owned, right? That's a very colonial mentality that is going to be brought into Africa and then part of the post-colonial situation. But for the colonizers coming, right, the way they get over that is that the inhabitants who are there either aren't really human like we are, right? That we're going to dehumanize them so you don't actually have the same rights and responsibilities as we do. And the other move with colonialism is that you're not civilized or cultured like we are. And one of the evidence of that, some evidence of that, is you don't have the relationship to the land like we do. You don't come up with concepts like private ownership. And more importantly, you haven't developed the lands. You haven't built cities and factories on this land. And the language of the colonizer across Africa, whether it was the French, Belgians, the British, right? They use the same language that this land is laying fallow, that the inhabitants haven't utilized or cultivated the land. And they'll talk about that. It's just God has left it there waiting for us to come as civilized man so that we can develop it. So that the indigenous population rights, either as humans or as relationship to the land, is going to be completely dismissed. And it is ironic, right? Because then they're like, well.
And there are just so many contradictions and hypocrisies built into white supremacy, colonialism, any sort of project, as you were describing it. That
absolutely, right? It is rife full of contradictions, and hypocrisies.
And yeah, so I would love to dive straight into the Congo, the Democratic Republic. Give us a thumbnail sketch of the Congo, how it came to be, and how it became liberated.
Yeah, so thumbnails, that's going to be tough, but I'll try and do this quickly. Right? So the Congo is that huge chunk of land right in the middle of the continent. And what was happening as the Europeans were moving in from all the various sides as they're colonizing throughout the 1800s, King Leopold II of Belgium, who was a late arrival, a newly created country, he was only the second king of Belgium, hence Leopold II. He wanted a colony, so what he did was he sent Henry Morton Stanley, a rising explorer, to go and lay claim for the entire river basin. There's massive amounts of space, 80 times larger than the Congo. And he did so. He sent Stanley there, and Stanley used force of arms. He used brutality. I always tell the story, you can never go backwards when he's in his travels because the amount of violence that he had used, just kind of burning, destroying villages. But he went around and by force of arms and also by trickery, laid claim to that land in the name of Leopold II, which is kind of interesting, not laying claim to the land for Belgium or the Belgian crown. It becomes his personal property. And when the European powers got together in Berlin, 1884, 1885, 2-year time called the Berlin Conference, where they effectively divided up the continent of Africa, Leopold claimed that huge section in the middle, and the rest of the European powers were happy to go along with that because that meant that he gets the territory, but no one else does, right? So it doesn't fall in the hands of the French or the Germans or the British or the Portuguese that are on the other side, right? This is a kind of a neutral zone. And in fact, Leopold basically made the promise that everyone can come and get access to the riches of the Congo. So the name of it was the Congo Free State. Not that the people were free, but that it was free market, that it was not a protected, everyone else had their protected colonies. This would be open. And so, but he was lying. And huge amounts of violence in terms of subjugating the peoples of the Congo. About half of the population was killed during the colonial project, which is just a stunning figure. The international pressure for Leopold to give up the Congo because of his just going over the top. The whole colonial project was violent, but his was particularly gruesome. He handed over that property to the Belgian government. It became a Belgian colony until the 1960s, when faced with some growing kind of pressures for independence, the Belgians just said, we're done. And in 1960, the country became independent.
And let's talk about the post-colonial nation building.
Yeah.
With an eye to your theory about land and otherness and ethnic differentiations, basically.
Yeah. So the Congo is a colonial creation, right? I mean, like Stanley is actively walking and creating this territory that didn't exist before. And in doing so, in creating the Congo, he's also creating the Congolese, that this is now an identity belonging to this state, this national identity, which didn't exist. In fact, there's around 200, depending on how you cut up the indigenous population, linguistically and so forth. You've got around 200 different groups that live in this new territory, which is going to be a significant challenge for how do you build a new nation with that type of diversity. And that's part of the reasons why you're going to see some secession movements early on, people breaking away, trying to claim their own state based on their own ethnic group. There's going to be a dictator who's going to come into power fairly early on, Joseph Mobutu. He'll change his name to Mobutu Sese Seko, and he'll change the name of the Congo to Zaire when he's in power. He's going to be in power from basically late 60s, early 70s, right up until the late 1990s. Really important American ally during the Cold War. Fairly brutal dictator, but he's trying to construct this Zairean identity, but also how he maintains himself in position is through divide and conquer. So that ethnic division, he's kind of exacerbating that as well. And for my work that I'm interested, especially in this book, is in the eastern part of the country, which has basically been at low level and sometimes very high level conflict since the 1990s. And it's partly tied to what's going on actually in neighboring Rwanda. But those questions around political identity and land are really significant out there in the East. And as Mobutu's power is collapsing in the 1990s, those tensions really come to the forefront.
And some of that tension, well, before I get to that, another point that comes up in the book a lot is this notion of the big men and the big manism. And could you talk about how the big man functions in your work and also in kind of the insurrectionary, violent conflict that seems to be always simmering under the surface?
Yeah, for sure. So the big man concept is something that's very familiar for African political science, right? People who study Africa kind of recognize this phenomenon in various ways. And it's got links to colonialism in terms of how the colonial states kind of carried out its own project and maintained its power, right? There's a term that gets used, and forgive me, right, for using everyone in their trade has shortcut terminology, right, to explain things, whether it's in the library or political science. There's a term called neo-patrimonialism that gets used to talk about African politics. And the neo there is the new is the idea that we have a modern state, all the infrastructure, all the institutions, it looks like a modern state. But behind that is this patrimonial practice of patron-client relations, right? So at the top is the patron. He's got some clients. He extracts resources up. He delivers favors down. And then underneath him, those clients are themselves patrons. And you have this hierarchical pyramid structuring of patronage. And so if you think about those points, right, the patrons all the way through are big men, right? And at the top is the big man, usually the presidents, and then his inner circle of big men, right? Some might be in the military, some might be in the economy. They're often trading back and forth. And so you've got this relationship of patron and client, which is core aspect of big men, right? So trickles all the way down. So any given region, you've got the big man, the regional big man. Any village, any town, you got the big man, right? And that's where power flows. You've got the formal structure of the state, and you've got the informal political structures. And sometimes they overlap, and sometimes they don't, right? But you have both of those going on at the same time. And how the regional big man plays himself out, especially in the last several decades, is by making sure that you've got armed militias to help ensure your position in power, right? You want to, provide your privileges, but you also want to make sure, the stick as well, that you've got some militias as well. And we see that in all four cases, right, where these regional big men are going to start using these autochthony discourses, this kind of I was here first, we were here first, therefore we have access to these political rights such as land. And you don't, and because we're now able to enforce those views or push those views forward through the use of violence, we can start seeing in Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Congo, we're moving into, these are no longer theoretical conversations or debates, we're now using violence to articulate these debates.
Well, let's talk about the violence that you saw in North Kivu. Is that
Kivu? Yeah.
And the different groups that were determined to be there first, and who were the strangers that.
Yeah, so it's hopefully I can do justice to this, because it's a little bit of a complicated story, right? But one thing we have to just stop thinking about, let's just not think about the colonial map that's going to get constructed. But before the colonial powers came in what is now Rwanda, but also in Eastern Congo, Burundi, that whole area, there was a political structure in place, a kingdom that had those privileged folks at the top, and then those less privileged at the bottom, right? And the privileged folks had access to political power, economic power, had access to land, and then the everyday folks at the bottom did not. And before colonialism, it was fairly porous, right? You could advance up the social and political hierarchy, or you could decline. You could lose your land, you could lose your cows, you could become a drunk, you could fall out of favor, or you could marry into position with family. So it's much more fluid. Those terms, the people at the top were regarded as Tutsi. The people at the bottom were Hutu. And the colonial powers came in, and those groups, those two groups, that larger kingdom gets divided up. So a good chunk of it goes to the Congo, good chunk of it goes to Rwanda, Burundi to the south, some of it in Uganda. So that kind of political social order is there. Now, there's a story that when the colonial powers get there, and this is an interesting story, is that they give an explanation of what has happened, that the people at the top, right, are the sons of Ham, the biblical sons of Ham who've come down, right? And that, those are the bottom, right? And that the folks at the top are the new immigrants from the Nile, right? The more chosen people, right? There's absolutely no evidence of this. It's a colonial myth tied to ideas about white supremacy and about Christian supremacy, and it's got no, but it catches hold because that's how the colonial power, specifically the Belgians, the Germans, and the English, are going to treat this, right? So there's this hypothesis that the people at the top, the Tutsi, are somehow closer to Western civilization and are newly arrived, and those at the bottom, the Hutus, are descendants of the sons of Ham. So that's the narrative that explains the newcomer versus the people who are here first. Not in there's absolutely no evidence of this at all. So what's going to happen is that structure becomes really solidified as to the Tutsis at the top, the Hutu at the bottom, and the Belgians are going to be using that both in the Congo and in Burundi and Rwanda as the way in which they're going to rule their countries. Until 1959, because of things that are happening in Belgium, they're going to switch and they're going to actually help the Hutu rise up and have a revolution, the social revolution in 1959 in Rwanda. What's happening is that there's movements of people that are going across the border, before we drew these borders, and then after the borders. And the Belgians are moving some people, encouraging people to move into Eastern Congo or to cultivate the land or to help work in some of the mining operations there. But what's going to happen is that in the newly created Congo, in the eastern part, that story of we were here before you were here. You're new here. You're either part of these Kenya Rwandan, these if you speak Rwandan, right? You're a newcomer here. And therefore you don't get the rights to land or the rights to political power, to get to vote, to get to run for election, to be a citizen, right? To be a citizen. And that question about whether you belong here and when you got here is it's very contentious because it's tied up in all those political issues about citizenship and power, but also extremely hard to prove, right? Extremely hard to prove. How can you prove, right, that you were here first? I see your house on this land, right? But how can you prove that this is your land, right? And how do I know that your grandmother or your grandfather didn't move here, right? And you can't prove that, right? There's no legal documentation. The Belgians weren't creating land deeds in this area, nor did they exist before. So there's no way in which you can provide legitimate legal documentation to back this up. So it becomes very contentious, and it's going to explode extremely violently in the 1990s around the Rwandan genocide, because then you're going to have a lot of refugees moving in and exacerbating the situation in the Eastern Congo. When I'm saying Eastern Congo, you mentioned there's two main provinces, North Kivu and South Kivu, and there's a Lake Kivu, and then there's Rwanda. So the two Kivu provinces are significant.
Well, let's talk about the Rwandan refugees, because I think we have, those of us who were alive back then remember the genocide. But what was happening in the Congo, and I think it is incredibly interesting, and it has some ties to what's going on in other places of the world today. But maybe if you could unpack that a bit for us and explain how, I mean, it seems obvious, but this marginalization of young men and how that turns into or is exploited by the big manism kind of,
Yeah, so there's tensions before the genocide. There's been tensions for a while, but those really become exacerbated in the early 1990s, right? So I mentioned Mobutu was in power. He was fading from power. And one of the things he tried to do is he had a national conference to bring people together. And it's significant because that question of who belongs in the East, right, in the Kivus, gets played out there at the national conference, right? The representatives come from the Kivus, and they, on the floor of the National Conference, said, this is a really big deal. We have these invading forces, the Banyarwanda, or the South Kivu Banyamulenge, which are Rwandan speakers, right? And they could have come over in 1959 after the social revolution. They could have come over in 1930. They could have come over in 1830. They could have come over in 1730. We just don't know, right? But there's a kind of a collective guilt that they don't belong. And in fact, they keep the representatives from those groups from coming to the national conference and speaking. So this becomes a national issue. And then there's actual violence, right? Some armed militias in the area decide that they're going to start using violence to go after the Banyarwanda, or in the south, Banyamulenge. It's the same basic group. And it doesn't matter if they're Hutu or Tutsi, right? They're both seen as you're invading. You're new here. You don't belong here. And so there's already that tension. And then in Rwanda, there's greater tension because there's been a civil war going on between Tutsi, who had fled the country and are trying to come back because they've been denied citizenship as refugees in Uganda, and they're also being denied citizenship in Rwanda. They have no place to go, so they pick up arms and say, we're going to go back to Rwanda. There's a civil war. The Hutu regime in power is fighting them. Once it becomes clear that they're not going to win, they enact a genocide and kill around 800,000 people, right? Tutsi as well as Hutu moderates and so forth. So you're going to have an influx of people who are fleeing as the genocide is occurring, and they're going Uganda, Tanzania, but they're also going into the Eastern Congo, which is, you can go either from the north, Goma, or the south, Bukavu, you're going across. And then once the genocide ends, and the genocide ends because that Tutsi rebel group wins, right? They take over. This is 30 years ago, almost to the week. They win and drive out those forces that have been committing the genocide into the Eastern Congo. So you've now got massive displacement of people in refugee camps, but also just outside of refugee camps, which is exacerbating that tension, because if you look at the map, it looks Eastern Congo looks like it's in the middle of nowhere, but like this is incredible. It's very rich land, but it's also densely populated. So the population pressures here are quite strong. And so if we're dividing up land to our sons and to our sons and to our sons, that land that we're having is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And then we're trying to grow crops on the land. But those people over there are herders, and they've got cattle, and they're cutting through our land and destroying our land. So the cattle farmer tensions in Eastern Congo are extremely, extremely tense. And that's the root of part of the land use. Who owns the land and how are we going to use the land? And then if we add on to the fact that there's minerals under this land as well, that some people want to get access to draw out minerals such as gold, diamond, coltan, that's going to be a further exacerbation. So by the end of 94, all the tensions are there with in Eastern Congo, and they're gonna explode in a couple of years when basically that Rwandan government who's come to power just wants to clear all those criminals that they regard as criminals out, especially because they're looking across the border and they're seeing their brothers under attack by Congolese. And so they're going to help come in and then eventually move across the country to drive Mobutu out. But then the whole region becomes enmeshed in conflict and violence, which continues today. Ebbs and flows, but we're still here today.
Well, and do you have time to talk about Liberia?
I do. Liberia's all four cases are different, right? This is, Congo is this question on political identity because of the way we drew the borders around it pre-existing. Kenya, what's interesting is it's not so much who was here first, but the colonial powers came in, stole the best land, pushed people off, and now they're trying to fight over the scraps of land, right? In Liberia, it gets a little more complicated. I know, John, you know this because Liberia was actually created by the United States. In the United States, in the 1820s to 1860s, about 4 decades, were taking returned slaves back to Africa, and they were taking them either from the United States, where they were stopping slave traders on the high seas, and they were taking them to Liberia. Now, the slaves weren't originally from Liberia; they're coming from the Congo and Angola, so they're taking them there, and they're depositing them there. And the U.S. Navy actually established again by force that we're going to claim this land. U.S. created a quasi-colony, but that it wasn't our colony. We didn't lay claim to it, but we established the colony in 1847. It becomes the Republic of Liberia. But what's interesting is the people, the slaves that we've been returning, the Americo-Liberian elites, created elites. They're the top of the structure there. And they're effectively recreating antebellum Southern culture. It's really kind of bizarre in the long history view that we're creating this culture of the plantation system and the plantation economy, right? Where we're going to use the new slaves become the original indigenous folks. So the Americo-Liberian elites are the newcomers, right? And they're going to be in power until they're actually that government is going to be overthrown. And I guess I got to check. It's 79. It's 79 when Samuel Doe overthrows them in a military coup. And so the Americo-Liberian elites they're displaced, right? But at the same time, that question about you don't belong here, that you're a newcomer, right? That is used against the Americo-Liberian elites after the 1979 coup, is also reproduced to the people in the north. And there's a county in the very north called Lofa County. And there's two groups of people there, the Loma and the Mandingo. And again, it's who was here first, right? So the story in Lofa County is there was one guy who was forced out of the northern parts and moves into Liberia, where he subjugates the indigenous peoples. This is part of the story. And then he establishes his lineage, who's claiming land, cultivates the land, and that's the beginning of the Loma people. Now, the story is he left his brother behind. His brother will eventually come and create their lineage, and that is the Mandingo people. So they both go back. But the story they're telling is the Loma got here first, right? It wasn't originally ours because we came and we stole it from the indigenous people and subjugated the indigenous people and started cultivating the land. But we got here before you did. Now, all of this happened well before we established Liberia. But what's going to happen is those tensions between the Loma and the Mandingo folks in terms of who has political rights, who can be a citizen, right? So because the Mandingos won't be recognized as Liberian citizens until the mid-20th century. Right? They're denied citizenship, so they can't own land, they can't vote, they can't run for elections. So there's a political structure that sees them as outsiders, right? Even though there's cross marriaging and so forth, right? If you can claim that I belong here and you don't, and again, it's always slippery and difficult, then you're basically making a political claim. This became at the forefront when after Charles Taylor is going to lead a rebellion against Samuel Doe in 1989, and the Civil War is going to erupt. And it's going to set those two groups, the Loma and the Mandingo, against each other. And will continue then beyond that, where both are trying to use violence to kind of ensure that their claims to political identity, to belonging, and therefore to the land is established. Because in Lofa County, land is very, very important, and it's a shrinking commodity, again, with population pressures. So land is significant.
Well, yeah, thank you for that. And I think one of the things that comes across in that story of the Mandingo and the Lofa, and also the one you told about in the Congo, is that there are these, the colonial project of Sons of Ham and all that kind of stuff. There's this collective memory or fiction that sets these political systems off that, when you really look at it, are not nonsensical. And it's the embodiment in the land and the people who have the land, and then the legal rights that. Am I summing this up correctly as far as the?
Yeah, it's one of the things that Morton and I do here is we want to underscore, right, so much of this is about storytelling, right? What is the narratives, right? We're constructing, not we, well, we are constructing a narrative, but the people who are laying claims to land are telling stories, right? They're telling stories about belonging. And it may sound nonsensical on the outside, right? But it makes sense. It's my internal cosmos. Right? This is my cosmology of explaining who I am and where I am in the world, right? And that can only be done through these narratives of, I can sit here and tell you, with all the various interviews, they'll be like, well, my father, and this is my grandfather, and this is my grandfather, my grandfather, my grandfather, and I can trace back this lineage because I have to. Right? Because I have to create this narrative that justifies my sense of belonging. Because if those narratives are thrown in doubt, right, then my claim to being autochthonous, to belonging, is undercut. And one of the things, both in Liberia, but especially in the Congo, is you can claim to be autochthonous, that you are indigenous, you have the right. And then the next day, someone may say, well, I heard, your grandmother is actually from, Ivory Coast or is from Burundi, right? And that really undercuts. And then you could be like, well, my father wasn't, my grandfather was from here. And it's like, well, we heard that you're illegitimate, right? And these are stories that get told, right? Those stories are undercutting those claims of belonging. And how do you prove that? Right? How do you prove that you were here first, right? And in these cases, you can't. But so much of your social and your political identity, and then all the rights and privileges that come with that, are bound up in these stories. That, the story of Ham, to me, and I think to you, John, sounds a little crazy. But in 2024, I still encounter it all the time because it's an important way for someone to trace all the way back to lay claims to who they are in this cosmology that they're constructing.
So is there a way to create a stable state on top of this system of?
So John, that's a great question, right? And I always, when I'm talking about the Congo, I always want to point out that one of the primary sources of insecurity is the state itself, right? That the state is the one that is changing the citizenship laws. The state is the one that is affecting land ownership. That the state is the one whose military is, preying on local populations, right? And so when we think about the Congo, we've got one of the longest, most expensive peacekeeping forces by the United Nations in the Congo. And their number one priority has always been like, one of the ways we can resolve the conflict is by strengthening the state. But if the state is the source of the insecurity, that's part of the problem. Now, I'm not an anarchist, right? But in political science, it's very clear that the state, constructs these threats to justify its own existence, right? I mean, it is, it's what's the term that we use, right? It's a racket, right? It's providing protection against threats that it itself constructs, right? And so fundamentally at the state making the process of making a state is violence, and maintaining a state is violence. We see it all the time in all states, right? And just in these cases, the dynamics have changed so that it's functioning in a way that the state is not providing physical or even psychic security, but actually exacerbating that.
Well, and if you look at the the time frame in which these states have existed, there isn't a lot of time to build it into a bureaucracy or hide it within a system of legal justifications and courts.
For sure, right? So this, in some ways, as we talk about in the book, some ways we have the post-colonial state crisis, right? Because this is a post-colonial state that's only been around for 100 some odd years, and is built on the colonial state, which was extractive to its core, right? But at the same time, we're also in the 21st century in the context of globalization with all the global pressures, and we think about in terms of economic flows, social flows. The way that the global economy is structured today doesn't require the state the way the global economy in the 18th and 19th century really needed the state to help create colonialism, to help create the global capitalist system. Today, we don't need the state so much. So the crisis of the state is particularly acute in post-colonial cases across Africa, but it's also acute everywhere, right? United States, Norway, Belgium, right? If Belgium will be a country in 20 years, who knows, right? So those pressures that we see in the African context are not unique. The manifestations might be specific to those individual cases, but we see that happening elsewhere, right? We see that happening in the United States. I mean, these conversations we're having, this rhetoric that's being utilized, that we were here first, therefore we get political rights and you don't, right? And we're going to use the state to keep you out. That's common in Norway, Slovakia, the United States, Brazil.
Yeah,
by the moment we find ourselves in.
Right. And it seems to me that it's going to become more pronounced as we move forward into a world where some places become more and more inhospitable to human life. And there's going to be a refugee crisis that is going to cause.
Yeah, we didn't even, at 100%, John, you're 100% right. We didn't even address that in this book, but this is something that I have been working on for a while. And my other research around Africa is the way that climate change is going to affect how people, large groups of the population, are going to be occupying land that is going to become less and less hospitable. And with all the implications of that globally, right? We're going to global refugee crisis, climate refugee crisis is going to keep continuing.
I mean, I think one of the most unfortunate terms we've created recently is permanent refugee camps.
Right.
You have these refugee camps that have existed for 20 years, and it's, it's how anyway, thank you for the interview, and any closing thoughts on what we've been talking about?
No, I really appreciate it. I mean, my closing thought is thank you for having me come here and talk to you about situations or concepts that I think most people don't pay attention to in terms of thinking about Africa, but are very significant to the lives of Africans, but also it is part of our global situation today. So the lessons that we can take away here, I think, are applicable across the globe to varying degrees. So thank you very much for letting me come and talk to you about this stuff.